Welcome to Module 105. This is an overview of the Daktronics media player setting. In this module, we'll cover the DMP 8000 media player configuration utility. This is applicable to the DMP 8120, 8121, and 8122, and eventually the 8124 models of media player that we sell primarily for LCD-based digital signage. Let's take a look at the Daktronics media player configuration utility, the DMP 8000. So in a browser, I'm going to call up this initial sort of launch screen for the player utility, and it gives me some information about the media player configuration right up front. We'll go through the dialogues here. So that's the initial startup screen. To configure the media player, you'll enter this little config screen, and we'll go through and kind of look at how one might configure a media player, a DMP, for digital signage usage. First off, there's a name for the player and a description. Whether or not touchscreen or kiosk mode is enabled or disabled. Typically this will be disabled unless the player is going to run as some sort of interactive player. The device ID, this comes from the media player itself, and there's a registration code that shows up when the media player is first configured. The boot sequence choice here is typically set and not really something you need to be messed with. So there's the network information. Typically we're going to set these up for DHCP. There's DNS configuration below. Typically this is going to be pre-configured and not something you have to worry about too much. The output setups or physical outputs on the player and the setup for those. Players can be 1, 2, or 4 output media players, and we access each of those outputs via this setup. So for output 1, here's the physical setup of that in terms of the resolution, whether or not we want keying off, the color mode, and again, most of this will be pre-configured and set. Default audio setup, typically we're in digital signage world, we're not going to have audio enabled, although you can. We'll leave this disabled. That's kind of the default. And then we have a sign configuration, and the sign is the actual output. So I mentioned there was 1, 2, and 4 output media players. Each of those outputs or connectors is called a sign, and I can configure those independently here to address all of the different settings that might be necessary for that. Single sign or single output media player has the following setups: display modes. Bezel compensation would not be used for a single channel media player. There's fit mode. Typically we're just going to leave that non-specified. We'll leave output location set to its defaults. I can restart the player either on schedule or manually through this dialog. The VIP settings, if I want to associate this player with a processor. I can map real-time data to this media player. It's not something that we need to worry about too much in digital signage world, but in live events, certainly you might have the desire to map RTD data or real-time data to this media player so that the graphics and things that are playing out also have access to those available data sources. And that's done through this RTD mapping. Default content, I can choose default screens to play during times when media is not scheduled on the player. So if we go to the next screen, we're going to take a peek at what's actually playing. So this is kind of the monitoring screen, and this is what's currently designated to play out on sign 1. I do have a set of test patterns that I can employ here. I can add a file and use that file to test output. I do need admin permissions, but as you can see here, there are a number of different test patterns that are available just to set up. Obviously I can zoom in and out here or scale to fit the the display I'm looking at this on. I can create system backups manually and even restore from a backup. I can restore from one of those backups, or I can create a system backup. And finally, as I look at this, I can see that there's a number of profiles available. And profiles are basically a file that includes all of the settings. So all of these settings that were employed and set up here in the config screen, I can save those as a profile and implement the setup on this media player just through a single click of a button. These media players are going to ship with one of these profiles already applied. Each media player is going to be shipped to the customer site with the correct profile already assigned and even associated to the correct Venus account. So very little of this configuration will be necessary. This video is primarily for troubleshooting, for investigation purposes if you need to understand how the media player is configured, but primarily in real-world usage, the media players are going to ship configured for LCD-based digital signage solution, and most of this information in the config screen won't need to be altered at all. Thank you very much. Again, any questions? Feel free to reach out to training or to product management for suggestions or questions, and hopefully we've answered some of those today.